carve-outs that Microsoft says, Activision Blizzard, you will be paying these fines, if any? We've seen that a couple of times in the FCPA world. Does that also happen in the SEC world?
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a great play. That's a great play for Microsoft to say, we're going to clean house. We're going to carve this out. That's still Activision's problem. We don't want to buy that part of Activision, but we want the rest. So it's a good, I think, even just political play, and I think that makes sense in a way if they can divorce sort of slices of Activision or characteristics of Activision in order to look like the white knight here. That I think is something I would think would be on the table.
Jonathan Armstrong, honoring the BeeGees with your white shirt today, duly noted for our audience who is watching us live. And your song, of course, is How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? But what do you see from either the UK or EU regulatory perspective? Both Matt and Karen have talked about some of the US regulators. In terms of big tech, Microsoft is not usually at the top of the EU regulators aiming right now, but they certainly have been in the past in the United States. So where do you see that from your perspective?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I think it's almost like a 4-step test, I think, where in the on the Microsoft team here. And I think that we've got to remember, haven't we, that this ain't a US domestic deal, or it isn't purely a US domestic deal. And I think we might get surprises in outside the US, even if they can square people in the US. Let's just look at Japan, for example. One of the big losers in this deal might be Sony. The Japanese antitrust regulators raided Microsoft as long ago as 2004. Microsoft are on the radar in Japan, and even if Microsoft can lobby away the US authorities, is their lobbying power greater than Sony's in Japan? I'm not sure it is. So I think you end up with a 4-step test, and some of this is repeating themes that Matt and Karen have said already. I think Karen's right that your first step is due diligence. And were I Microsoft, I'd want some sort of enhanced due diligence process here. So what makes their world go round? You have to look not only, I think, at the sort of stuff that you conventionally do in due diligence, things like policies and procedures, but you also have to look at practices as well. It's those 3 Ps that are critical, not just the 2. And why this is challenging is that even from my experience, the very best firms at M&A are often okay at doing 1 and 2. They're very poor at doing number 3. And Jay might have ideas in terms of putting boots on the ground and monitors, etc. But it definitely requires grey hair to do that piece. And if big M&A firms are using the triangle model of the grey hairs at the top doing very little work and the worker bees at the bottom doing all of the work, then that creates real difficulties. And we've seen it before when corporations have acquired problem organizations that due diligence has been ineffective. So if I'd want to be enhancing that pre-acquisition due diligence, and let's hope for their sake that they've done a good job of that already. And that, to repeat, is going to have to be senior lawyers, senior compliance professionals, not something that you farm off to the worker bees at the bottom, however talented they are. I agree with Matt that I think the next step is then to look at antitrust concerns. And I think the real worry here will be any form of Xbox exclusivity. So you may even get a deal passing the regulators first time round, and then when some of the commercial agreements get stitched intra-company, it could even come back again with a different opinion from antitrust regulators. And in some respects, that's the worst of all worlds for Microsoft, because the deal's cleared, it's done, it's a cash deal. They've paid the cash out. And then the regulator says, hang on, that thing you're planning on doing, you can't do. And then they're left with a sort of lack of integration. So I think you've got to, again, look at Microsoft's history here. There is a concern that, PlayStation and others could be harmed. There are already complaints, I think 31 complaints currently before the European Commission for alleged anti-competitive practices by Microsoft relating to OneDrive. There have been complaints to the European Commission about Microsoft since 2004 again. Novell, remember Novell? Novell, I think, were the first complainant to the Commission. In 1993, there was a $794 million fine for Microsoft from the Commission. That fine was upped to $1.4 billion in 2008 because they hadn't done what they said they would relating to the 1993 fine, it seems. So Karen's right. The good news is that Microsoft and their team will be well known to the competition authorities in the EU. And the bad news is that they are well known to the competition authorities in the EU. Here, of course, Brexit adds complexity because pre-Brexit, the European Commission would have taken the lead on this, perhaps delegated work down to in-country competition authorities, but Microsoft would have got one clearance or not from the EU as a whole. Now, of course, they will have to speak to the UK authorities as well as the EU authorities. And why is that problematical? Well, that's problematical because there is already a UK Competition and Markets Authority investigation into Microsoft. They're still trying to get clearance for their acquisition of Nuance, and that's just gone through what's called the phase 1 decision, which sort of means that the CMA have decided that there is a potential distortion of the market. They're going to have to crawl over that. So we're likely to see this almost be stitched on to an existing investigation. And that's probably worse than an ab initio knock on the door, because there's already, if you like, an assumption that anti-competitive practice has gone on. So then my third phase, if I can get through antitrust, is looking at things like integration and divestiture. Here, I think I've got slightly better news. I'm not big into gaming, but from what I understand the portfolio has gaming products that appeal to different demographics. So Candy Crush, for example, I think is known as whatever the term for silver surfing gamers is. Those annoying people who sit next to you on trains and move fruit around. Well, that's a different market to the market that Microsoft's going for with Xbox. So there is a potential deal to be done there to it would be a rude thing to say, to push off the wrinklies somewhere else. But there are potential ways, I think, that Microsoft could splice and dice the acquisition, which might get some comfort for them. So can a loser ever win? Well, first of all, I think there are going to have to be all sorts of concessions, not just with antitrust regulators, but other regulators as well. Data protection authorities can block this deal. I think some people have said in the past that any corporation who tells you a deal isn't just about the data, that probably means it's just about the data. And we have had German regulators, for example, in the past try and block the Google double-click deal, saying that they had inherent powers under what has become GDPR to block data transfers and therefore to block the merger of the two corporations. So even if you can get an antitrust clearance, you could get a privacy regulator prohibiting the sharing of data. And that's part of the business model for the whole deal, to get data on Activision gamers, presumably into getting them addicted to Xbox instead of whatever platform they're using at the moment. So so I think there are all sorts of issues to go at. Culture we've discussed already. There's obviously this whole culture as well between what might be perceived to be hip and trendy gaming brands and odd to say, but what's perceived as very much a old school corporation in Microsoft. You know, it's a bit like, I don't know, trying to play you know, a right on game with your granddad. And I think there's that, not only the bad, potentially toxic culture of the acquisition, but also the sort of fuddy-duddy culture of Microsoft that'll play through people's minds. And that whole difference between you know, I've had gaming clients, and often your approach is to get the game to market quickly and fix it. Now, Microsoft have been accused of that in the past with their products, but they've tried to cure that reputation by saying, we iron out the bugs, and then you, Mr. Corporation, can take our stuff and it's good to go. So there's all sorts of compliance issues if you're changing to a game development culture for corporate applications as well. There's always going to be that tension within the business. And then maybe just one other point, and I could make many more, or two other points. First of all, don't estimate issues like FCPA. Microsoft, again, has had challenges with its Hungarian operations. There are at least allegations that some titles might be bought in different ways in the gaming industry versus other industries, that some deals might be done with distributors that are different from conventional businesses. They'll have to be alive to that. And then I think additionally, the whole data piece has other challenges. Back in 2000, the FTC intervened in Disney's acquisition of data relating to the collapsed Toy Smart. That was a whole mess. Disney ended up paying money into the bankruptcy to destroy the data, and there was still an FTC investigation into that. My worry is that unless you've got the right, you know, GDPR logic in place to move the data from this entity to the other, that could lead to fines as well. And then I guess my final thing, so if you can get through all of those hurdles, how do you make things good with the regulators? So how do you stop the rain from falling? Well, I think the main thing really is to try and get ahead of this. Look at the investigations that are ongoing. And as Karen said, hopefully you've got a list of those from the due diligence process. And then you're going to have to develop a plan for approaching those regulators, explaining what you're doing. So you're going to have to look at similar regulatory interventions. What were the orders that the regulators made in those cases? Which of those do we think that we're prepared to concede? And then have an honest discussion with the regulators to say, we think you're going to ask us to do 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We agree, we'll do it. We're the new owners, and things will be different from now on. So if you can do that, you can mend a broken heart. But there's an enormous amount of work involved from getting from A to B to C to D. So in simple terms, a 4-step plan from me, Tom. There's a whole load of work involved in that.
Do you have a comment or question for Jonathan?
You know, as I'm listening to Jonathan, a question has popped into my mind. This merger does go through and everything is integrated. Does that mean I could invite play Call of Duty while we're on a Microsoft Teams meeting? Because that, I think, would actually be awesome if we could pull that off. But I did just want to say 2 points. Number one, we should remember that for all of the hurdles we're laying out, Microsoft is very confident it can pull this off because it has agreed to a 3-year breakup fee to Activision if this all.
Mhm.
So clearly, they're pretty confident that by some way or other, they're going to be able to make this go through. But as I was listening to Jonathan talk about the privacy and security concerns, which I think are also considerable, still fall back to, so what would the Federal Trade Commission actually do? Like, what's going to be the mechanism to allow this to go through? And we're going to watch what you're doing, because we should remember about 10 years ago, I think it was, the FTC signed a deal with Facebook after a privacy snafu, and maybe Jonathan could read me in on the details. I don't remember. It was around 2011, 2012. Facebook agreed side audit every year of its privacy efforts by a Big Four firm, which then started producing these reports every year saying Facebook's privacy efforts were excellent, and they right as Facebook wound up with that enormous data privacy snafu with Cambridge Analytica and user data being spilled into the 2016 and the Russian operations using Facebook in favor of Donald Trump and all this stuff, and they pay a $5 billion fine. So what exactly are we going to do here? You know, if we're going to have an outside audit, how do you make sure that's effective? Because Facebook, and this is going to be bigger, you know, do you have a outside compliance monitor? And I don't know what the mechanism would be, which brings me back to my point that, you know, maybe the simplest solution for the regulators is just to say, we're not going to do it. But I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, the difficulty I think you have in Europe is if you look at the data piece alone, you've not got to persuade one regulator, you've got to persuade 30. And the issue with DoubleClick and Google is there was a vociferous but fairly minor regulator who just said, I'm prohibiting the deal. Now, eventually, I don't think he managed to prohibit it. But I think now some of the German regulators, for example, they can order, even if the deal is done, they can order that Division A can't transfer data to Division B. So you could end up acquiring like a steel hulk when you thought you were acquiring a battleship, because you can't do anything with the data. And I think that's almost more worrying than the deal not being done at all, as I say, because you've waved the cash goodbye, but you can't get those integration efficiencies. You can't do the cross-selling that you want to do. So there's an enormous amount of effort to be done, I think, to look at who the regulators are who are likely to object like that, and then to have a strategy to get all of them on board. But that is, like, as the French would say, a real exercise in aliment de canard.
So, Jay Rosen, you have to love somebody. But the question I think the whole gang wants to pose to you is, what could a monitor do? Matt and Karen have both talked about this, and Jonathan as well. What could a monitor do from the antitrust angle? What could a monitor do from the compliance angle? And after Jonathan's session, what could a monitor perhaps do from the data privacy angle, and roll that all of that up into your BeeGees assignment?
Okay, well, the song was entitled "To Love Somebody," and I think what this is all about is to make some money. And Microsoft in the past has been very opportunistic. When the other guy was in charge and he didn't like TikTok and wanted it to be spun off, Microsoft was Johnny on the spot, and they were there waiting to embrace TikTok with open arms, but didn't happen. And one of my questions before I answered the big potpourri that you asked, Tom, is that this came to light in the summer, early fall. In December, I guess Microsoft began negotiating actively. And my question is how much information could you have found out in 3 or 4 months that you're going to say, I've got a $3 billion breakup fee here? Yeah. So either they know something because they're inside players, or the question is that, yes, the stock was depressed by 30%. Let's go in there and do it. And now here comes the questions of all the function of a monitor, how a monitor can help. And in one of my prior lives, I was in middle market investment banking. We did a lot of M&A. And one of the things that I noticed is the lawyers and the accountants, they love to rush in. And for what Jonathan's always talking about, they love to pull the data. And they pull the data on sales. Every company has this great hockey stick growth pattern that, oh, we got to buy them, we got to pay 3x, we got to pay 5x. But the question is how do, when you're doing due diligence, they tend to run out of steam when it gets down to be doing cultural due diligence. And when you're doing ethics and compliance due diligence, because there's really nobody who has a seat at the table that wants to make that work. The lawyers want to cross the T's and dot the I's and get paid. The accountants want to get paid, but nobody's looking at cultural assessment. So if we bring the construct of the monitor to bear right now, Microsoft's just, Activision Blizzard has just been under all this scrutiny. So if I'm Microsoft, I'm going to say, well, do I want to believe everything that the lawyers that Activision Blizzard are telling me? They've been embedded. We've already got a company that's out there in the press. People are worried about the statements that are coming. We had our friend, the CCO, who we picked apart several months ago. We've got Bobby Kotick, who supposedly hasn't told the board things, but he has told the board and they still trust him. So the first thing I would do is figure out who are my troops that I'm sending in to do due diligence. And this due diligence, I might want to forecast it as a way that what happens in a monitorship. And what happens in a monitorship is that the regulating body, whether it's DOJ, FTC, FCC, they bring a monitor in to ensure that the company is going to comply with what they said they were going to do over the next 12, 24 to 36 months. So we were once in a case working for a telecom company that acquired another telecom company, and they had to make sure that they provided lifeline service to low-income customers. So we were brought in there to be the monitor to make sure that the settlement was upheld. It wasn't anything criminal. It wasn't anything specious, but we were there to roll up our sleeves. And what we ended up doing is we secret shopped this company, and we called up in English and we called up in Spanish, and we wanted to get those lifeline services, and we wanted to see whether or not the client would provide those. So the first thing I would do is that I would figure out, maybe discount the due diligence that's already been done. And then I'd want my own law firm in there. And then as part of the law firm, I want somebody who can do this cultural assessment, because you can't wall off these charges. If you're going to move forward, you're going to say, we have a clean company, we have the best of breed ethics and compliance and cultural programs. You can't make that statement now, especially after what we've seen in the last 4 to 5 months. So you take that, what the monitor does on the tail end, and you move that to the front end of what you're doing from your due diligence perspective. And then you've all given good, good prescriptions about how to deal with antitrust and how to deal with the regulators. But it's going to be, I think, you being Microsoft trying to grow, and how do you find the people whose voices that you can trust enough to bet $3 billion on?
The scope of the legal obligations that you've heard bandied about here, overlaid with really a cultural component, does it really make sense to bring in a monitor to look at culture, or is that part of ongoing due diligence, or can you actually try to remediate during this process as if you were under some type of investigation where you're trying to fix things before the end of the day final penalty?
Yeah, I think the last way is the way I would choose to go. That there, believe it or not, there are situations when affiliated monitors gets engaged proactively when the client is not under the microscope of a regulator. And in that point, what we try to do is, you're not bound by anything. So if we want to focus on dealing with the cultural aspects, when we eventually get to the regulator, we can say, we've been looking at the ethics and compliance here for the past X number of months. We've begun to mitigate certain factors, and here's what you do. And what happens more often than not, is when you go to the regulator and unasked by them, you present what you've done on your own. That is usually at least good for one feather in your bonnet, if not more. So that proactive path that you outlined, Tom, I think really needs to be done. And the regulators are going to ask for that. So why not be proactive, and why not do it ahead of time? And, that's what happens. I was talking to a colleague before, and we were talking about, when monitors get put on FCPA matters. And they were talking about, this is a large, big Am Law 100 firm. And they are saying when they begin to do their investigation, they immediately begin to do remediation at the same time. And so if you just imagine that time is money, by pushing that up in the process, said that way for you, Jonathan, you are in a better position with the regulator. Ultimately, you're going to save money. And at the end of the day, you're going to have a better company. And that's what I think is the one I want to leave with, is I don't know how quickly you can take this culture that's at Activision Blizzard and just cure it because it's now under a different name. I think they're really got to get under the hood, get dirty and greasy, figure out where these people were, get them out of there, but more importantly, set up this program that going forward, that you can have a speak up culture, and that you can have certain things, certain rights to not being retaliated against. So at the end of the day, that's where my focus is it's not that a rose will smell just as sweet by any other name, but I want to see real, hard, reflective change.
So I'm going to slide in this episode and talk about the board of directors. And my song is Jive Talking. And the first lyrics of Jive Talking is, of course, it's just your jive talking. And I hope that it's not the Microsoft board of directors who are jive talking, because they have a very important role in this. Matt and Karen both touched on several critical elements from U.S. regulatory angles. But I want to speak maybe about the board's obligations here. Number one, this is an all-cash deal. That tells you Microsoft had $79 billion or $69 billion in cash. And when you have that sort of money, no matter how big your company is, you need to have a specific and special board committee overseeing this. So what's the role of the board in the oversight? Matt really, I thought, hit it right on the head when he talked about Activision Blizzard is a distressed asset, and they're a distressed asset from self-inflicted wounds. So the part Jay said about being about the money, it's absolutely spot on. Microsoft saw, I think, a great opportunity to step in, create the number 3 gaming company in the world if they pass regulatory scrutiny at a distressed price, even with the $3 billion breakup fee. I think they see this as an excellent value. I can only think that the price is actually going to go down, Karen, because of some of the carve-outs that they're going to have, Activision's going to have for the regulatory settlements that they come up with. But the board needs to move from having a special board committee on the purchase of this to actually overseeing the change and the investigations leading to remediations as well. And Jay talked about what could be done on a proactive basis. I think that the Microsoft special committee running this needs to be actively involved, and whoever on senior management or compliance or finance or whoever's reporting to the board, they need to have consistent meetings with the board, and the board needs to be involved really in the steps ongoing, because this is so high profile. We've talked about the myriad of regulators literally across the world who are going to be looking at this from a variety of angles. So I just hope that the board of directors is fulfilling a special obligation and that they're overseeing this. And then, of course, when we get to the closing, I hope that a special board committee continues to be a part of the integration, of post-acquisition integration of everything that we've talked about in this podcast so far. So the board has a very big role here. If you look to the one acquisition that failed because of lack of board involvement was the most famous in my mind is HP and now I've just forgot the
Autonomy.
Yes, autonomy, because the board was not actively involved in that for a variety of reasons. And so that after the integration, or after closing rather, the integration of this is going to be absolutely critical, both from the legal, cultural, and commercial practices perspective. So if the Microsoft board is listening, and I hope you are actively involved in this, not simply from the price point, but from all of the issues that we've raised in this podcast so far. And now, as I mentioned at the start of this podcast, we have a special segment where we're going to pay honor to Meatloaf. Fellow Texan Meatloaf, whether you go with the formal Mr. Loaf or the informal Meat. He was a big part of my rock and roll life, starting in college and all the way forward. And my tribute's going to be, of course, to Paradise by the Dashboard Light. Not simply because it's the prurient song, or song for every prurient teenage boy who may be a little bit older now, but because the first time I played that song, I told my dad to listen very carefully, because there was an insert from Phil Rizzuto where he called a base runner in the context of a boy and girl in the backseat of a car. And when it got to the end and there was a play at the plate, somebody was going to maybe score a home run. We don't know what happened, but my father had one of the biggest grins I've ever seen. And that struck me for several reasons. One, the greatness of Phil Rizzuto. Number two, the greatness of the song, but also that, we boys, we just never grow up. So my memory from Meatloaf is Paradise for the Dashboard Light. Jay, what do you have for us?
Since I'm one of those folks who do remember Meatloaf, I'm going to go with "You Took the Words Right Out of My Mouth," aka Hot Summer Night. On a hot summer night, would you offer your throat to the wolf with the red roses? Yes, I bet you say that to all the boys. I have a couple memories of Meatloaf. In 1975, the Rocky Horror Picture Show came out. Meatloaf was in the cast in London. He played Eddie. And there's a point where you talk back at the screen and everyone says, "What's for dinner?" Meatloaf. The other Meatloaf record memory is from 1978, when he first appeared on Saturday Night Live. And to actually see that big, sweaty ball of human singing passion, I didn't know what to make of it, but I knew I liked it. So here's to you, Mr. Loaf, singing up in that band in the sky.
Mr. Armstrong?
Yeah, I've a sporting memory for Meatloaf. So some of you will know my hometown club is Hartlepool United, and I've been to Hartlepool have a checkered history both on and off the pitch. They have a couple of moments of glory. One when the great Brian Clough was manager. But effectively, I've been to at least two final games when the money ran out and they were meant to be the last game before the club's extinction. And in the last 15 years or so, some of you will know that Meatloaf professed to be a Hartlepool United fan, and he would carry around with him a Hartlepool United mascot, which was something of his comfort, it seems, when traveling. So whenever we've been in financial difficulty for the past 15 years or so, the word has gone round the ground, don't worry, Meatloaf will save us. So the danger, I think, for all Hartlepool United fans today is that our plan B, if you like, has gone. But I'm inspired by the fact that Wrexham, a club in broadly similar financial circumstances, have been taken over recently by Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney. So my joy is that I get to speak about this on this podcast. We all know how many Hollywood A-listers listen to this podcast on a regular basis. So if any of you are out there, give me a call. You can be the new Meatloaf.
Matt Kelly, what do you have for us?
Well, as much as I do appreciate that Meatloaf was a good artist, I was not the hugest Meatloaf fan, but I like what he did. I'm just going to share a certain segment of the population who's out there. This is what they are experiencing with it. And this memory happened just this morning with me when I was chatting with a very accomplished compliance officer. 30, did you hear that Meatloaf died? And they said, folks, maybe we're going to feel a bit old. Significant portion of the world out there who just didn't know who he was and had to go and look him up. And that's all I have for.
Well, Karen, what do you have for us of a memory of Meatloaf?
Well, I wanted to highlight, which Jay did as well, which Meatloaf was not just an incredible singer, but he had a number of acting credits to his name, the most, famous of which is Rocky Horror. And so the song that I always think of when I think of Meatloaf, other than, of course, Paradise by the Dashboard Light, which Tom already took, is the Hot Patooties Bless My Soul from Rocky Horror. So I mean, Rocky Horror is obviously formative for everyone in every generation, I think, at different times. But the thing that is funny is that my memory is that my father, whose birthday is on Sunday, every year, no matter what the scenario is, we have to have Meatloaf on his birthday. That's just a known thing. That's the birthday dinner order. So I will be having that on Sunday with my parents, and that song likely will be in the background because you have to play Meatloaf when you're eating Meatloaf.
Well, that's great. Okay, and now we are on to our fan favorite section of shout outs and rants. Mr. Armstrong, do you have a shout out and or rant for us today?
Yeah, I have a shout out to Emin. So for those of you who are not familiar with her work, she's the sort of, if you like, the former enfant terrible of the Brit art scene. Her works include My Bed, which was a bed which exhibited various activities that had gone on in the bed, and another work called Everyone I Have Ever Slept With, 1963 to 1995, which was a tent embroidered with the names of various individuals. Now, Tracey Emin has had a hard life and some difficulties in her past, but she's been very generous both to charities and to the nation. I was up in Scotland just before New Year's to see a really stunning sculpture that she'd just given to a gallery in Scotland for being kind to her whilst her works were being exhibited there. There was a bid, I think, of 75,000 sterling for this sculpture, but she'd given it to the gallery for free. And in 2011, she gave a work to the British government called More Passion. It's a neon sign installation. It was said to be one of the favourite works of David Cameron. And whilst it was given to the government art collection, it was assigned, possibly after David Cameron's intervention, to number 10. And it's been displayed on the wall in number 10. Tracey Emin explained the work by saying it was meant to promote a happy atmosphere like fun fairs, casinos, or bars. But this week, she's asked for it to be removed from number 10. She said that Boris Johnson's government did not require any encouragement for a party. And she said, it's not a political thing, it's a moral, ethical thing. So when you're the prime minister of a country and you're being lectured on morals and ethics by a Britpop artist, that to me is the time to go. And we've had alliteration throughout this podcast, with the BeeGees being a famous example of alliteration. So I've got another example for you now. Bojo, just go.
Matt Kelly, what do you have for us?
I have something that is probably close and sad and serious lament that I just wanted to call the compliance officer's attention. This is the case of a missing girl in New Hampshire, 7 years old, by the name of Harmony Montgomery. Police for her for the last 4 weeks or so, and she actually since 2019 and had been unaccounted for because this girl's drug-addled mother was ignored while she tried desperately to raise alarms about her missing daughter for months. And seriously, the girl, Harmony, bounced back and forth between the mother and the father, who is named Adam Montgomery. He is currently under arrest for assaulting his daughter at some point. He is not cooperating with with police and other law enforcement about where he be right now. He in the past had drug. He was arrested in Massachusetts in 2014. This is the man who wound up in custody had custody of her daughter because the mother, Crystal Sorey, was a drug user. She was homeless. And because of that, when in 2020 or so, that her daughter hadn't been seen for months and had no idea where her daughter was, but knew the father was absolutely not a good person to care for her, she started telling police. She started telling social work. School. Daughter enrolled there. She knocked on doors where her daughter was. None anywhere until about 4 or 5 weeks. She was more and more assertive. I think she finally reached out to the mayor of Manchester and started talking to the press. And that is when I realized, well, wait a minute. This woman's for real. We have no idea where this girl has been for 18 months because the people were not listening to the mother because she was a mess. And I don't think she would really disagree with the statement that she was a mess. But that doesn't mean we should tune these people out. And I've been thinking about that because compliance officers, look, we all get a bunch of wackadoo calls, and that most wackadoo calls are probably just wackadoos. But this is a reminder that you have to sit and listen through all of the wackadoos to find the one wackadoo who is actually sincere and truthful and has something worth investigating. Because if we had taken this woman seriously, perhaps this girl Harmony, we would know where she is today, but we have no idea where she is. And that this case is going to turn out the way it's probably going to turn out. And it's a very grim, sobering reminder about the importance of a listen up culture that we failed here in Massachusetts and New Hampshire to do that correctly.
Karen Woody.
All right. Well, I'm going to change the tone a little bit. Mine is much more lighthearted. In fact, I will say the last time I did the shouts and rants, I shouted out to the travel industry and the people who are helping. But I realized that was an aberration from my usual shout out to some sort of pop culture or recommendation. So I've co-opted shouts and rants somewhat to be Woody's pop culture Rex. So I'm going back to that today because my this week, my shout out is to this fantastic show that I've only now discovered, even though it's been on the air, I think, for a while. But I learned that it might be coming out with the 5th season. And that is the French comedy called Call My Agent. It's a fantastic show. You have to be willing to read the subtitles in French, which I suggest, I think, makes you smarter. You both learn French and you read while watching television. So it's a win all around. But it's a lovely show. It's hysterical. And I'm looking forward to the 5th season that is apparently coming out next year or sometime soon. But again, it's all about sort of the Parisian side of, it's like Entourage-ish, but not really. But it's the Parisian side of talent agency and the movie industry. And so there are a lot of very funny, high-profile guests on it. And so I would recommend it as a lighthearted way to avoid thinking about some of these heavier things at the end of the day.
So I'm going to give a shout out. First of all, I should preface this that Everything Compliance Gang has really led many efforts in pop culture. Karen Woody started early Emmy buzz with Ted Lasso. Matt Kelly has started a very early 2023 Oscar buzz for Paul Rudd in Ant-Man 3 and an earlier. Well, I want to not start some Oscar buzz, but I want to add to some Oscar buzz for the Joel Coen movie version of the Shakespeare play Macbeth. I think both Denzel Washington and his wife, Frances McDormand, should both receive Oscars, but I want to focus on Catherine Hunter. Catherine Hunter played four roles actually in the play, and she played the Twisted Sisters or the Three Witches. And Catherine Hunter is a fabulous performance artist from the United Kingdom. She played the role using her body as much as her language. And it was fabulous. She was in one of the very first scenes where she, as the sister, gives a prophecy to Macbeth, which leads him down the road to wreck and ruin. I don't want to shout out to Catherine Hunter. I hope she gets an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actor or Actress. If you haven't seen the play, see it. It's a fabulous interpretation by Joel Coen as well. So, Jay Rosen, you want to close us out on shout outs and rants?
I want to clean up, and I want to give a shout out to Boston Red Sox great slugger, David Big Papi Ortiz. He's on the Hall of Fame ballot for the first time ever. And Boston's own Dan Shaughnessy did not include Big Papi on the list of his choices for the Hall of Fame. David Ortiz says, Dan Shaughnessy's been an a-hole to everybody, so what can I tell you? It's not a surprise for me. It's not a surprise for you. Now, he didn't vote for me, so what can I do? I mean, seriously, there's not going to be anything that I can do that this one guy didn't vote for you. I can't stop it, and there's nothing you can do about it. So here's to Big Papi taking a healthy attitude towards a little criticism from a sports writer, and let's hope he gets into the Hall of Fame in 2022. Back to you, Tom.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, it's been a fabulous episode. Thanks for everyone's great cultural references. Thanks for all the insights into Activision and Microsoft. If you're listening, everyone on this podcast has an email that will be listed in the show